When I was only 17 years old, I had my leg amputated without anesthesia or drugs of any sort. Well, let me rephrase that. I amputated my own leg at 17. I just recently started telling me I did it myself. It makes it sound like I was more in control than I was at the time. It was in the early 80s when I was 17, and my family had moved to a farm before I was even born. My mother hated the city, and it was just like my dad to grant my mother's every desire. At the time, I made fun of him for it, but now I realize he was a smart man. I grew up on that farm. My dad had taken me out to do chores from earliest memory. I had been working with some form of tractor since I was 14. My parents were strict with teaching us how to safely operate the machinery. What happened that day was just unexpected. Nobody would have predicted it, even me. That morning, I woke up earlier than I typically did on account of my father being sick. Last night, he was barely able to get out of bed for longer than 5 minutes, let alone drive heavy machinery. I didn't mind. I knew that if I did this for him now, he would probably give me a weekend off just to relax like a normal teen. We had always practiced being fair. Since everyone was still in bed, I took myself outside as quietly as I could. I didn't see a reason to wake the whole house when they didn't need to do outside chores this early. Once I was safely outside, I walked the distance to the barn, where our combine tractor stayed parked when it wasn't needed. I let myself get a nice stretch in before I climbed my way up the side and made myself comfortable. I turned the key and made my way out to the fields, letting the lull of the motor calm me. I hadn't even finished half of the field when I had this strange feeling start to creep over me. It wasn't something that happened all at once. It was just a little bit of an uncomfortable sensation that would come and go. I thought it was just related to maybe being out in the heat, or that it was just me needing to cool off and get some water. I checked the watch that was on my wrist, and seeing that I was nowhere near what I thought to be an acceptable stopping point, I figured just pushing myself a bit harder would be okay. At least until I found a good spot to take a break between. I would regret that, because as I was steering the tractor, I felt what felt like a lightning bolt shoot through me. I remember realizing that I was falling, and then I felt a powerful thud as it went pitch black. When I opened my eyes next, it was like stars exploding all around me. I don't mean that in a nice way either. My eyes flew open when I felt a searing pain that was burning into my lower body. It felt like every nerve ending in my body had a live wire running through it. I struggled to force myself to focus, look around, try to see what exactly was happening to me. Forcing myself to raise my neck up off the hard ground, what I saw caused revulsion to roll through me. I found back the bile that was rising in my throat. I could see my normally denim pant leg now a dark crimson. The red continued to seep into the grass around me. I screamed until I thought my vocal cords were going to rip apart. I don't know why I bothered, because I knew that nobody would be able to hear me way out here, and even if they could, the tractor would drown it out. When I felt like I couldn't scream anymore, I took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. I examined my leg as best as I could, and realized that while my femoral artery was mostly intact, if I didn't get help soon, then I would bleed out before anyone even knew. With my muscles aching, I pulled myself up to a seated position. The pants leg was mangled, which left from right below my knee down, a tangled mess of gore. The good news was that my legs stopped the machine from advancing further up for the moment, but if something makes it possible for the tractor to start moving again, I knew I'd be done for. Unfortunately, I knew what I was going to have to do if I wanted to get out of this alive, but it didn't make the realization any easier. At best, nobody would be out here for another 3 hours. Staring down at what was my leg, I said a muffled prayer. I pushed myself up off my back and squirmed until I was in a sitting position and able to lean down, trying to pull the fabric away from the wound. I winced as I carefully moved the denim, revealing a red and bloody sight. I could clearly see the white of my bone in spots that bones were not meant to even be. I gagged instinctively. When I went to bend further, I could feel the tractor lurch a centimeter. The pain flared once more. I was going to have to either remove my leg myself or simply tug away from the tractor to free my leg. I had little hope that I could get it free with the leg attached. I patted down the pockets of my coveralls. I felt something solid, and when I could free it from the fabric, I was just happy to have a knife at my disposal. It was a smaller version of a pocket knife, but as sharp as a new butcher set. I said one more silent prayer and braced myself for the next challenge. My best plan involved me cutting through the tissue of the leg. Since there wasn't much keeping it connected, one good hit would break the phone in half, then I could go. I felt the tractor lurch once more, and when the adrenaline kicked in, I brought the handle of the knife down onto the bone, full force. The pain that rattled around the inside of my skull nearly caused me to pass out, but I managed to stay lucid. Flipping the knife back around, I started to cut. I have to thank the adrenaline or the shock for making the actual cutting almost painless. The only thing I could feel was the skin being loosened like the pop of an elastic band. Looking down, I could see I was 90% of the way done, and with a final slash of the knife, I was free. I took a few seconds to catch my breath and make sure that I wasn't going to pass out, and then I had phase 3 of the plan. Before moving, I ripped off the shirt under the overalls and tied it above the wound as tight as I could. I knew that crawling would be too long, but in order to walk, I needed the blood flow to slow down. The tightening of the fabric sent a jolt of pain, but I had to ignore it. I just cut myself out of this. A fabric was nothing. I rolled myself to a position that allowed me to gradually raise to a standing position. I held one arm out to steady myself before I started to go back. When I could feel that my balance was better, I started to slowly hop towards the house. It didn't take long for me to realize, however, that I couldn't do that for long after exhausting myself and falling. Not wanting to risk passing out, I started to pull myself towards safety with my arms and used the good leg to push. I learned that doing so was 10 times quicker than hopping. It felt like hours by the time I could see our home in the distance. The energy was slowly starting to run out and I could feel my muscles going limp. I kept trying to fight it off, but nothing was working. Before the darkness enveloped me completely, I screamed a blood-curdling scream to try to get anyone's attention who could hear. The next time I opened my eyes, I was in a sterile white room with what used to be my leg, wrapped in white bandages below the knee. I wasn't hurting, but I was out of it. I could tell this was a hospital, and I cried as I realized that I was okay, despite the leg. My mom was in the corner. She rushed forward to offer a hug. I don't remember much else from that time. My mom said that she heard a scream and it sounded almost primal. When she realized it was coming from our property, she rushed out to see. That was when she saw me from a short distance and called for help. She told me I was awake during the ambulance ride, but it's been years, and those memories never came back. After college, I took a job at a local hospital working in the birth and death records department. New hires had to work their way up, so I started out working the night shift. The office that we were in sat at the bottom of the hospital. Conveniently, it was also annexed in a corner of the morgue. The autopsy stadium was also down there with us too. When I worked night shift, it wasn't unusual for it to just be me. Now that I've been there for a while, I'm fine with it. But when I first started, I wanted to walk out the first week. One of the first shifts I had by myself was purely accidental. A girl had a family emergency, and I was called to cover her shift. I got there a few minutes early to get myself together and situated for the night. The night started off slowly enough. I finished off the records that were placed haphazardly on the desk and began to work through the emails I had. I was getting into a relaxed rhythm and felt myself drifting into a comfortable stream of productivity. I was going on at a steady speed that would make it feasible to catch up if I could limit distractions. But before I could think further into it, the desk phone rang. I stopped typing on the keyboard and picked it up on ring 2. Before I could say anything, I was told that they had a fresh one coming down that died from sharp force trauma or stabbing. I agreed and listened for them to be buzzed in. It came 5 minutes later. I hit the button that allowed them in, and 2 men rolled in a cart that had a black bag on the top of it. They left a file on the counter and turned to walk out without another word. I thought it was weird, because normally they'd say something, even if it's just a name. How rude they were had rubbed me the wrong way, but I did my best to brush it off. Walking over, I grabbed the file and began to read. From what the report said, this was a middle-aged male that had been stabbed and slashed several times before he finally bled out. From the diagrams, it appeared to be focused on the head and neck area. I unzipped the bag carefully and pulled the edges apart. The shock of seeing a corpse doesn't completely go away, but the shape of this one was even more strange. I continued to look at it for a few more seconds, and went to the computer to access some files to input his chart in. I sat there filtering through last names when I heard something that sounded like a shuffle. I looked up to see what it was, but at first look, nothing seemed out of place. Thinking I was imagining it, I went back to work. I was still on the same file when it happened again. This time, instead of just looking, I stood up and walked from the desk. I felt a lump in my throat when I realized that my corpse's hand was off the gurney. I couldn't help but laugh at how absurd I was acting. Despite belief, things like that can and do happen on occasion. I just placed it back on the table and walked off. Nothing major. I managed to get most of the chart work handled when this time I heard the same noise, but longer. Knowing that it is happening twice was strange. I walked back to the dead man. I froze when I realized his whole arm was off the table now. I backed up as a reflex and looked in both directions. Nothing except me and my vivid imagination. "Hello?" I asked nobody. I heard no reply. I fixed the arm again and stepped back. Once I was seated again, I had to go pull another chart. Now for the man on the table. Upon searching the database, the name didn't exist. He wasn't even in our records. I quickly snatched the record that came with him and realized that there were in fact no markings from our hospital anywhere on it. I felt my heart rate increase tenfold. I tried to remember back in training what we were told to do, but I didn't remember that being in the handbook. I went back towards the front of the office and paced in circles, working out where this man was from. Mid-step, I heard clattering. I don't know what triggered the feeling, but something felt very wrong. I grabbed the desk phone and pressed redial to call the last extension that I received, since that was who sent the body. It didn't ring. It went straight to settings saying that the voicemail hadn't been set up yet. I could feel blood rushing to my head. My chest was getting tighter. I slammed the receiver down and let out some less than savory words. I plopped back into the rolling chair and sunk my head into my hands. I felt stupid for being so worked up, but the fact that our hospital didn't have a record was still eating at me. I tried to rationalize waiting for the number to call back, but after several minutes with no luck, I decided I'd try again. I picked it up and pressed the call button. Still nothing. As I hung up the phone, from the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the body's chest move. I took cautious steps to check, and when I approached the table and reached my hand out, I yelped like a wounded dog. It wasn't on purpose. I just didn't expect the phone to ring at that exact time. I rushed to answer it for fear that if I missed it, I wouldn't hear back. I was disappointed when I answered it, and it was just guest services calling to do their usual rounds. Finally, after I decided that I physically would not be able to wait, I called our department head to ask about the man. He sounded like he had been asleep, and usually I'd feel bad, but not right now. I stepped away from the office and into the open hallway, happy to feel less caged in. When we started talking, I wasted no time asking what I needed to know. "What is the deal with the deceased in the morgue with me right now?" A few uncomfortable moments passed before I heard him clear his throat. The next words were ones that I can still hear sometimes. "You aren't supposed to have a body right now. I wasn't notified that any were brought to us. Are you okay?" His words caused my ears to ring, and I ran back through the doors into the morgue. My body slammed the door as I entered and darted to the back. I nearly collapsed. There was nobody, nothing, not even a body bag. I remember my muscles tensed as if I was trying to attack. Turning in circles, I started to think of places someone could be. When I went towards the table, I saw a shadow dart across the wall on the far side and headed towards it. I can't really tell you the plan, but I needed to figure out what was happening. From the other side, I watched a shadow of feet shuffle on the flooring. When I saw it take off again to the cooler portion, I thought that they had run towards it because I saw the swing door move. I figured they went that way and there wasn't an exit, so it would trap them. I made it to the door before it registered that nothing was inside. Nothing came in here. I was chasing ghosts. Naturally, I chastised myself for being so panicky. It was in the middle of this scolding that I felt two hands hidden between my shoulder blades, knocking me into the cold air. Inside, I could hear a lock click. Dread was what formed in the pit of my stomach. When I lunged back to the door, I was just shoved through. I was beating in a frenzy. All composure was gone. It was only when I started to hyperventilate that the door mysteriously opened. I crept out of the door, still wary of what I was going to find. It was still in the room. You could hear a pin drop. I kept on creeping to the center of the room, until every light in the room lit up. I was so beside myself that I didn't realize that several people were standing in front of me, including the dead man. I was never told that an initiation that often happened there was someone would play a prank on the new hires. The dead man was really a urologist in the hospital who was friends with the department head. Livid, I felt my blood boil. It took coworkers nearly 2 weeks of me not speaking to them for them to realize how upset their prank made me. Now that it's been some time, I laugh at it. But boy, at the time it wasn't funny at all. One of my first jobs was in the national park in my hometown. Growing up, I had heard stories about the woods, but I never bought into them. It was a cool campfire tale, but to me, that was all. I was a born skeptic. When I landed the job at the park, I was ecstatic because I loved to hike the trails and it let me roam around in places that I had been since I could walk. Even my dad used to go there. Until one day, he just stopped taking me. He would never tell me why, even after begging. I finally just stopped asking him. We never spoke of the park again. When I took the park job, my father was visibly upset about it. He wouldn't even congratulate me. Anyway, I started the job, and it was perfect. I loved it. It never felt like I was actually working. One night, right as it started to get dark earlier in the day, I was asked to cover a shift for a coworker. Knowing that I didn't have plans for the night, I agreed. It would result in a bigger check, so I was fine with it. Well, that night I got there around 7:30 p.m. It was already dark when I made it in, since it got dark at 5 or so now. The other worker left when I came in, and then it was just me. I started the shift by just going through and straightening up the main office area and break room. It was a habit I had. It only took me an hour or so, and then I was back in the main desk watching the monitors. Just as usual, I pulled my cell out and propped it up so I could also watch a show. They never really cared unless you weren't doing your actual job. The office, we had only had windows that faced a parking lot out front. There weren't any side windows, which means I stayed in the main office. The cameras were great for the areas in the park, but ironically, they didn't catch the front of the premises. It wasn't until close to midnight that things started to get weird. As I sat in the chair, I heard something hit the front door. It sounded too heavy to be a pebble. Annoyed, but not concerned, I opened the door, and on the front step was a water shoe, the kind you would wear into a lake. It was neon orange, and it was just sitting, with the toes pointing as if it was coming into the building. I stopped and looked at the shoe, but I didn't see anyone outside. Putting it out of my mind, I picked the shoe up to take to Lost and Found. I shut the front door back and turned back around. However, what I saw made no sense. Another neon orange water shoe sat in the hallway that went to the back offices, toes pointing in that direction. I knew it wasn't there before, so I picked it up too and called out to see if anyone answered, but no such luck. I walked to the back and threw the shoes in the box before going through every room in that building searching for whoever left the shoes. I thought it had to be my co-workers just being stupid. When I didn't find anyone, I went back to the screens and sat back down. I tried to laugh at how ridiculous I was being. I wasn't paying attention to the screens when I saw the screen illuminate. A motion-censored light had flicked to life in the woods. I stared at the screen to see if it would reveal anything, but nothing. Not even a bug flew in front of our screen. I thought I was just starting to freak myself out. I didn't reach out to anyone else from work because I knew they would just give me grief. Finally, I just tried to pretend nothing ever happened. It worked until I stepped outside to smoke. I stood by my truck and lit my cigarette. It was cool outside, so I stood trying to shield myself from the wind. It was then that I finally saw it. A shadow in the shape of a human dancing through the tree line. I threw my cigarette into the ashtray next to me before I snatched my flashlight and headed towards the start of the forest. One thing I noticed from even outside of the woods is that at night, everything is utterly still. It's almost like there is no living creature inside of these trees. I paid careful attention to where I was going, trying to navigate myself safely around. I was just far enough in that when I turned around, I couldn't clearly see the cars. I turned to face forward and listened. For the first 2 seconds, nothing. Then, as I was making up my mind that I was being a wimp, a sound came from deeper in the trees. It sounded like someone crying. More specifically, a woman crying. I couldn't tell which way it was coming from, though. It sounded like it was everywhere. It gradually increased in volume as I walked ahead. A few more yards and I could hear sniffling. I began to grow more concerned, and when I went to grab my radio, it wasn't there. The holster I kept in was just gone. I was trembling. I had heard the stories of the woods at night and never believed it, but I started to question it when I heard something else. Twigs snapping from behind me, really close behind me. I stopped my steps, and when I did, so did the twigs. I tried to surprise whoever was stalking me, and when I turned backwards, I caught sight of a dark hooded figure dart to the left and run. I gave chase, dodging limbs and roots. When I made it to a fork that was on the path, the figure was gone. Not a trace, just vanished. I turned in circles trying to see if I could find him in any direction. One, I was about to give up. I saw it step from behind a giant tree trunk ahead of me. Once more, I ran forward. As I ran, the crying was getting louder. It was more frantic. At times, it was almost a scream. Then my heart stopped. I heard my name, not being yelled, but whispered from directly behind me. Now, I ran, not towards something, but away. I was looking for the exit of the woods, but it seemed to go on forever. Any way I looked, there was more darkness. Even the lights from the parking lot were gone. I felt myself started to hyperventilate. It was like the things that I recognized daily were foreign. I ran a few more yards before I doubled over, still looking for air. I only heard a single solitary twig break before I was off again. I probably should have tried to notice that I was running further into the woods, not out. Finally, after I felt my energy fully deplete, I fell to the forest floor. When looked to the left for a final time, I saw the figure still standing, looming. It started to slowly advance my way, and I just felt too tired to run anymore. I was waiting to see what had turned me into prey. I could hear twigs snapping louder with every step. Snap, snap, snap. It was a slow and methodical pace, which made it even worse. I was totally tuned into the shape that when I heard someone yell out a "hello," I bolted back into a sitting position. I looked to the right in time to see another two figures, one holding a flashlight with reflective gear. I called back and quickly looked back to the figure that was now gone. The couple who came up to me had been in the woods camping when they heard the screaming too. When they found me, they thought I was the source of the wailing. They helped me get back to the office and made sure I was okay, and that was how I realized I had been going the opposite way the entire time. I thanked them so many times when we walked back into the lot that when we heard that distinct wailing again, I forgot why they looked so confused. They thought the wails were me. They weren't. Without even a question, all of us hurried inside of the office building and slammed the door behind us, locking both locks. Once inside, we just stared at each other. They didn't return outside until daylight broke. I didn't blame them. I even skipped on the rounds for the night. When they left the next morning, I went to the security footage and searched to see if I could see anything on camera. I hit fast forward until the shoe appeared. As I stared at the footage, nothing came up except for me. I was the one running, but it didn't show anything there to chase me. I never looked at the footage again. When I told my dad about it, he just said, "I know."